An $80 million urban fund vanished from the ledgers. Quietly, skillfully, completely. No press release, no trail, just gone. Until one afternoon, in a nearly empty hearing room, J.D. Vance picked up a forgotten memo. A single sheet of paper, a name, a date. And when he stood before the mic and read just one line aloud, even Jasmine Crockett, polished, practiced, couldn't fake the smile she'd rehearsed 100 times. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about choices, about towns promised help and then left behind, about who rises and who's quietly erased along the way. Now, a gentle note as we begin. This story is fictional, crafted from imagination, but rooted in feelings many Americans know too well. The names are real, the events are not, but the emotions, the questions, the stakes, those are unmistakably ours. So take a breath. Because this isn't just a headline reimagined, it's a story millions will recognize. Stay with us. Sometimes the quietest truths are the ones that stay with you longest. The hallways of Capitol Hill carry a different weight after sunset. Gone are the sound bites, the reporters, the aides pretending not to eavesdrop. What's left is echo, footsteps on marble, overhead fluorescence flickering to power-saving mode, and the thin hum of a nation too tired to rest. J.D. Vance walked alone, sleeves rolled, tie loose, brow furrowed not with rage, but with the fatigue that comes from reading too much spin and not enough truth. His staff had long gone home. The hearing had ended hours ago, a dry affair about discretionary budgets and regional offsets. But something about today still itched at the back of his mind. He turned the brass handle to the hearing chamber, now nearly empty. One janitor, two chairs still out of line, a congressional nameplate crooked on the panel. It wasn't silence. It was the kind of stillness that makes a man think slower, look deeper, and that's when he saw it. A thick green binder, the kind usually stuffed with printouts that no one actually reads, sat abandoned near the end of the long witness table, forgotten or left behind. Its edge peaked just slightly over the lip, like it hadn't meant to stay. J.D. hesitated only a second. Then instinct, or something closer to suspicion, pulled him forward. He flipped open the cover. No label, no initials, no committee stamp, just paper. Dozens of pages, and on top, a title in black ink. Reallocation Proposal, Urban Rebalance Initiative. He blinked. It wasn't a title he recognized from the hearing, not from the week's docket, not even from his own briefings. He sat down. The chamber now felt colder. He turned the first page, and what he read made his eyes slow down. The language wasn't illegal, just indecipherable. Sentences bloated with jargon, targeted opportunity zones, equity-aligned transfer channels, soft-touch fiscal redirection. Every paragraph danced just outside clarity, the way political language does when it's trying to hide something in plain sight. And then he saw the number. Total estimated reallocation, $80,400,000. From where? He flipped back. In fine print beneath a table, redirected from line items 3B, 7D, and 9F. Midwest Infrastructure Stabilization and Veterans Facility Upgrades. He stopped breathing for a moment. Those weren't just budget lines. Those were real projects. Promised grants to Toledo, Dayton, and Wheeling. Projects that, according to his staff, had quietly stalled months ago, with no official explanation. They were supposed to fund updated rail systems, public broadband, and long-delayed VA clinic repairs. And now, this? J.D. scanned for a signature. None. He checked the footer. No date. No origin code. No identifying marks of who submitted the document. He flipped again. No cover letter, no initials. Just a breadcrumb trail, clean and quiet, pointing to one thing. $80 million had moved, and no one had been told. He closed the binder halfway, then opened it again. Part of him wondered if it might vanish if he blinked. The other part knew he'd just stepped into something that wasn't supposed to be found. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Was this an oversight? Or was it a deliberate whisper, left behind in a room that people were expected to leave without looking back. In Washington, accidents are rarely accidents. JD didn't know who had authored the memo, but he had one name in his head anyway. One name that had been unusually vocal during the hearing, pushing for new urban vitality platforms, without ever quite explaining what they were. Jasmine Crockett. He stood up slowly, binder in hand, and looked around the empty room as if expecting someone to stop him. No one did, but something had started, and for the first time in weeks, J.D. Vance wasn't tired anymore. He was awake and watching. J.D. didn't sleep that night. He stayed in his office with the green binder open like a crime scene folder, the lamp casting a golden triangle across a desk cluttered with budget line items and sticky notes. Around 7 a.m., his legislative aide, Marcus, arrived early, coffee in one hand, tired sarcasm in the other. "What's with the hostage crisis vibe?" J.D. didn't answer. He just slid the binder across the desk. Marcus sat, opened it, read the title, scanned a few pages. Then he stopped, exactly where J.D. had stopped. 80 million? Marcus asked, sitting up straighter. Diverted from Midwest infrastructure and veteran care? J.D. nodded slowly. No author, no date, no record. It wasn't part of yesterday's agenda. I want every project from lines 3B, 7D, and 9F traced. What got canceled? What never got finished? By mid-morning, the office had turned into a war room. 3 laptops, 2 whiteboards, and a growing list of towns that had quietly fallen off the funding map. The deeper they looked, the uglier the trend became. Toledo's broadband expansion grant terminated mid-contract. The city had already dug trenches, laid conduit, and hired workers. Then suddenly, nothing. Contractors walked away unpaid. Dayton's veteran clinic, redesigned for modern rehab care, approved and promised under the VA Enhancement Act. The site was cleared, then fenced, then forgotten. Wheeling's Industrial Revitalization Grant, once hailed as a pilot program for post-coal manufacturing jobs, gone without explanation. Each one shared the same pattern. Greenlit, started, then left half-buried with no press release, no press coverage, and no public explanation. And each one, J.D. noticed, was followed in local news by glowing headlines praising a new urban equity project funded somewhere else entirely. These weren't in the Midwest. They weren't in towns with shuttered plants or hospitals. They were in swing districts, high-visibility urban corridors, places with cameras, and the money hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected into a private fund with a polished name, the Urban Rebalance Initiative. Registered under a nonprofit headquartered in D.C., the fund had vague mission language, investing in under-resourced communities through adaptive infrastructure solutions and cultural capital development. The language was precise, lawyer-built, and policy-proofed. But when J.D.'s team dug into the actual filings, only 3 major investments could be verified. A media lab at a private arts college in Brooklyn, a consulting symposium in Atlanta focused on narrative architecture, and a marketing campaign rebranding bus lines in Phoenix to reflect community resilience. J.D. leaned back in his chair, speechless for a moment. "This isn't reinvestment," he said finally. "This is set dressing." Theodore Marcus looked up. "You think this was political?" J.D. nodded. "It's not illegal, but it's not accidental either. Someone redirected federal lifelines into press release projects and hoped no one from the Midwest would read the fine print." A silence settled over the room. Not shock, just recognition. "Pull every congressional mention of this fund," J.D. said. "See who name-dropped it, who praised it, who filed amendments involving it. I want connections. I want timelines. I want names." And though J.D. didn't say it out loud, he already had one name in mind. Jasmine Crockett, the rising star who had built an entire narrative around funding the future without ever quite explaining who had paid the price. He looked down at the binder again. This wasn't just a document. It was a map, and someone had bet the country would never bother to follow it. The office lights had dimmed to a softer hue now. The sun had dipped behind the Capitol dome, casting long shadows across J.D.'s desk. But he wasn't done. There was one phrase in the document that kept circling back in his mind. A line so carefully constructed, it felt less like policy and more like code. Strategic narrative compliance supported via soft platforms. He had read it 4 times, each time slower, each time colder. Narrative compliance? Supported by what? Soft platforms? Was that social media? Local journalism? University think tanks? It was written with just enough precision to make it sound intentional and just enough vagueness to make it untraceable. JD leaned back, staring at the ceiling like it might drop an answer. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about story, about control. He called Marcus back in. "Do me a favor," JD said. "Search every committee log for the last 12 weeks. I want to know if this fund was ever formally introduced, appropriations, oversight, subcommittees, anything." By the next morning, Marcus had sifted through hundreds of pages. No author, he reported. No timestamp. No digital trail in the archives. No committee record. JD frowned. Then how the hell did it end up in that binder? Marcus shook his head. Could have been slipped in by a staffer. Could have been leaked. Or maybe, JD interrupted, maybe someone wanted it found, just not by the wrong person. There was a beat of silence, a shared understanding. In Washington, leaks don't just happen. They're either a warning or a trap. JD stared at the memo again. Then quietly, he opened the drawer beside him, pulled out a leather-bound notebook, and clicked his pen. On the top of the page, he wrote one sentence. When whispers shape budgets, it's no longer democracy, it's design. He paused, then underlined the word design. The rest of the team didn't know what to make of his silence over the next few hours. He said little, answered only what he had to. He moved differently, like a man walking through a house that he just realized might be on fire. He spent the next 2 days digging, not in headlines, but in the spaces between them. He reviewed transcripts of hearings where Jasmine Crockett had spoken with clarity but never specificity. He watched clips of her town halls, her press interviews, her polished sound bites about urban realignment and adaptive recovery zones. She had a gift, he noted. She said everything, without saying anything. And still, no proof, nothing direct, nothing that could hold in the weight of daylight. So JD made a decision. He wouldn't speak about the memo. Not yet. Not in public. Not until he could trace the line from the forgotten binder to a vote, to a dollar, to a name. Because in a town that thrives on noise, the only thing more dangerous than shouting the truth too early is whispering it without facts. He closed the binder gently, as if sealing something radioactive, and he whispered just to himself, "They'll expect me to come at this with fury, but this time I'll come with silence." And with that, he turned off the light, leaving only the faint outline of a green binder on his desk, quiet, unassuming, and full of questions the country wasn't ready to ask. Not yet. By the time JD returned to his office that Monday, the green binder had been moved to a locked drawer. But its contents? They had already begun to spread, quietly, methodically, through his team's spreadsheets, bookmarks, and underlined printouts. The memo was no longer just a curiosity, it was a trailhead. He walked in carrying a tube under his arm, set it down, and unrolled a massive archival map of the U.S. infrastructure development zones, the kind printed on thick canvas from a time before everything moved to screens. The push pins came next, red for canceled projects, blue for ongoing ones, black for untraceable. He worked in silence for nearly an hour, pin by pin. Gary, Indiana, red. Toledo, Ohio, red. Wheeling, West Virginia, red. Dayton, Ohio, red. South Bend, Canton, Youngstown. Each one had once been promised broadband expansion, VA clinic modernization, or manufacturing grant pilots. Each one had seen a ribbon-cutting ceremony and then a slow fade into silence. When Marcus walked in, JD was standing back from the map, arms crossed, staring like it was a battlefield. He didn't look over. "Something's off," JD muttered. "Look at the pattern." Marcus scanned the wall. "All post-industrial, mostly Midwest." "Exactly," JD said. "Now filter that against the headlines we flagged over the past 2 years." Marcus pulled up a file. Within seconds, a list populated. Local coverage, national blurbs, op-eds, even nonprofit blogs, all glowing. Urban Impact Program launches in Atlanta. Jasmine Crockett champions Arts Corridor in Houston. New Civic Tech Labs target underserved communities. Crockett's equity vision comes to life in key cities. JD turned back to the map. Every time a red pin drops, a glowing headline follows somewhere else. The equation was becoming uncomfortably clear. For every project killed in the Midwest, a Jasmine Crockett initiative was launched in a media-visible district. Not just urban areas, strategic urban areas, places with press, cameras, voter clout. None of this is illegal, Marcus said quietly. JD nodded. And that's what makes it dangerous. He leaned in, tracing a finger across the rusting spine of America, from Toledo to Wheeling. These weren't just towns. They were stories, places where factories were ghosts and schools doubled as shelters. These towns didn't have PR firms. They didn't host summits. They had potholes, layoffs, and VA clinics with broken elevators. But now, they had nothing at all. He stepped back again, then looked at the growing sea of red pins. "Tell me what these towns don't have," JD said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Other than working plumbing?" JD shook his head. "No, what they don't have that Crockett cities do." Marcus paused, then it clicked. Influence, media saturation, political value. JD nodded slowly. "We're not watching a budget shift. We're watching a story shift." And then, just above the top edge of the map, JD placed a final red pin. Youngstown, his father's hometown. No headline, no grant, just quiet abandonment. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to, because in that moment, what had started as an unsigned memo had become a pattern. And patterns, JD knew, weren't just academic. They were strategy. He reached for his notebook and wrote 3 words beneath the quote from last week: silence, shift, stage. And in the growing quiet of his office, beneath the soft tick of the analog clock, JD Vance decided something. This wasn't about catching someone in a lie. It was about exposing the architecture of forgetting. The call came just after 9 a.m. No appointment, no assistant screening, just a direct line from a burnt orange rotary phone in Gary, Indiana, to JD Vance's outer office. "He says he's not important," the intern said, holding the receiver with a puzzled look. "But that you'll care anyway." JD took the call. The voice on the other end was coarse, with that gritty, sun-weathered drawl that only came from decades spent near steel and smoke. "Senator Vance," the man said, "you don't know me. I was a railroad engineer for 31 years in Gary. I laid the steel that runs through the Port District." JD listened, quietly. "We were supposed to get a revamp," the man continued. "Had a team come in last spring, took pictures, made speeches, handed out those thick paper folders with revitalization printed in cursive." JD had heard the type before, folders thicker than the commitment behind them. "They said we'd be part of a regional rail rebirth," the man added. "But a month later, gone. No track, no crews, not even a surveyor left behind. You know what we got instead?" JD didn't answer. "A traveling mural exhibit," the man said, the bitterness barely restrained. "And a 2-day media seminar called Reimagining Rust Belt Identity." He chuckled dryly. "We didn't need TED Talks, Senator. We needed trains. We needed jobs. We needed someone who remembered we were still here." That last sentence didn't come out like anger. It came out like erosion, like something that had been said too many times in empty rooms. JD didn't interrupt. When the man hung up, JD wrote only 1 word in his notebook: Gary. 2 days later, he drove there. No cameras, no press team. Just JD in a dark jacket, collar turned up against the wind, as he stepped out onto the cracked concrete of a town once defined by motion and now frozen in memory. He passed rows of brick homes, many shuttered, some boarded, a few with flags still fluttering as if to insist that someone still believed in something. And then he found it. The VA clinic, closed, Metal gate drawn halfway like a curtain left unfinished. The sign still read, "Reopening Fall 2023," in faded red vinyl, curling at the edges from too many winters. A broken bench stood nearby. JD sat. He could still hear the man's voice in his head. "We needed someone who remembered we were still here." He watched as an old veteran in a navy jacket limped past with a cane and a grocery bag. He didn't look over. He didn't need to. Men like him had long stopped expecting recognition. JD stood and walked around the building. Through dusty windows, he could see faded linoleum floors, unopened supply boxes, and an empty front desk. It wasn't abandoned. It was paused. The kind of pause that can last years if no one's watching. He pulled out his phone, took a single photo, and texted it to Marcus back in D.C. They got murals, they were promised medicine. He stared at the building one last time, then turned back toward the car. The wind picked up as he walked. And as the steel-gray clouds rolled in above the old rail lines, JDD didn't just feel frustrated. He felt used. Back in Washington, the binder was no longer just a binder. It had become a magnet, pulling names and data points out of the shadows. JD's staff had spent the week cross-referencing every mention of the Urban Rebalance Initiative across federal databases, grant reports, and nonprofit registries. And what they uncovered only deepened the silence surrounding it. "It exists," Marcus said flatly, standing beside a monitor that displayed a basic 990 form. "Registered as a 501c3 nonprofit, headquartered in D.C. JD leaned over the screen. The mission statement was as polished and opaque as he expected: to promote adaptive urban recovery strategies through equitable community transformation. No specifics, no measurable goals, no identified beneficiaries, just keywords stitched together into the language of legitimacy." "Board members?" JD asked. Marcus pulled up the organizational chart. That's when JD's jaw set. There he was. Andre Kellis, political strategist, media consultant, and former senior advisor to Jasmine Crockett's congressional campaign. Known for building narrative-forward branding strategies, Kellis had been a rising star in political circles until he stepped back from the spotlight 2 years ago. The rumor was that he preferred operating behind the scenes now. Apparently, behind the scenes included handling federal money. JD exhaled slowly. The fund had received 3 major Department of Commerce grants in the past 18 months, all under discretionary allocations labeled as community adaptation or story-based equity pilots. Yet somehow not one of these had been reported in Crockett's press releases or public budget talks. Even more curious, the nonprofit had no published annual reports, no audit statements, and no listed leadership beyond a small 3-person board. "It's legal," Marcus said, still scrolling. "Technically, but it's a black box." JD nodded, eyes focused. "That's the whole point. They built something that passes every filter, but answers to no one." He walked over to the whiteboard, drew a circle labeled URI, Urban Rebalance Initiative, then began drawing lines outward, connecting redacted project numbers, canceled infrastructure reports, and names from committee minutes. The picture was messy, but something was taking shape, something designed not to be seen until it was already moving. He added one last name beside Kellis's: Jasmine Crockett. There was no direct tie yet, but the pattern was unmistakable. Every district Crockett had recently visited had benefited from this fund. Every committee where she had advocated for redefining urban value had seen a surge of approval for flexible reallocation. Every region she claimed was leading the next generation of civic infrastructure had received something from URI. Not steel, not clinics, not broadband. Story, exposure, symbol. JD stepped back from the board, arms crossed, eyes narrow. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's assume this is deliberate. Let's assume they knew exactly what they were doing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Then what now?" JD didn't hesitate. "We bring it into the light, all of it. I want a full trace. Who funded it? Who requested the grants? Who filed the language? And I want it done without fanfare. No leaks, no headlines." He paused. "Not yet." Because JD knew something his opponents didn't. If you shout too early, they dismiss you as angry. But if you wait, watch, build, Then when you finally speak, it's not noise, it's evidence. He looked once more at the screen, at the name of the nonprofit, at the network beneath it, and in that moment, J.D. Vance didn't feel like he was holding a smoking gun. He felt like he was standing in the smoke, and the only way out was to show the country where the fire really started. The chamber was already restless by the time J.D. Vance arrived. The House Budget Subcommittee Room 14A was rarely full, but today the seats were tighter, the cameras were hotter. Jasmine Crockett was present, seated 2 rows ahead, polished and poised, scrolling on her tablet, her expression unreadable. The agenda was simple, a routine budget review hearing intended to fly under the radar, until J.D. leaned into the chairperson during the break and said, just loud enough for the stenographer to hear, "I'll need 5 minutes, unscheduled." No one objected, yet. When his name was called, J.D. stepped forward slowly, a small flash drive in hand. No paper, no printed props, just one screen, and a long breath held just beneath his tie. He cleared his throat. No preamble, no political posturing. "Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief." A staffer loaded the file. The room's overhead monitor flickered to life. A spreadsheet appeared, columns, codes, and allocations. For a second, it looked like bureaucratic clutter. Then J.D. spoke. "These are federal project reallocations submitted over the past 18 months, tied to lines 3B, 7D, and 9F from the Department of Commerce infrastructure docket. Many of you have seen these numbers before. What I ask now is that we see where they ended." He clicked to the next slide. A list appeared. Town names, district numbers, grant purposes, and statuses. Toledo, broadband expansion. Withdrawn, redirected. Gary, regional rail. Terminated, alternate funding approved. Wheeling, VA clinic, retrofit. Frozen, pending reevaluation. 3 dozen lines like that, every single one tied to real projects in real towns. Projects promised but never completed. Murmurs began to rise. J.D. raised a hand. "Let me continue." Another slide. New names, different cities. Brooklyn, Media Lab Phoenix, Transit Branding Atlanta, Civic Narratives Conference. Each of these initiatives, J.D. continued, was funded within 60 days of a canceled infrastructure project, not through standard reallocation procedures, but through something called the Urban Rebalance Initiative, a fund with no public reporting, no federal oversight, and a board of 3. One of whom, he paused, letting the silence stretch, formerly served as the senior advisor to one of our colleagues seated here today. A few heads turned. J.D. didn't look toward Jasmine Crockett. Not yet. "I requested staff to trace the language used in the UR initiative filings," he went on, "and discovered a memo, dated but unsigned, logged during 2 of our committee's closed working sessions." He pulled up the final slide. A block of text filled the screen, the room now utterly still. Strategic narrative compliance supported via soft platforms. J.D. looked up, voice steady. "This isn't about reallocating funds. This is about reallocating visibility, taking money from forgotten towns and converting it into optics for more televised ones." He let the words settle, didn't rush them, because what came next wasn't anger. It was evidence. He tapped the screen one last time. No signature, no origin trail, but this memo was inserted into the working records during sessions chaired by Representative Crockett's subcommittee. The chamber held its breath. Crockett looked up from her tablet. Calm, almost expectant. The chair's gavel came down lightly. "Mr. Vance, your 5 minutes have elapsed." J.D. nodded. "Then I'll yield. But I hope we all understand. The question now isn't whether these communities were ignored. It's whether they were erased." He gathered his things slowly, eyes never leaving the screen. And as he returned to his seat, the silence was not empty. It was heavy. The kind that follows not confrontation, but exposure. The chair had barely lowered the gavel before Jasmine Crockett stood up. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask for recognition. She simply rose, smoothly, deliberately, and the movement alone sent a ripple through the room. Even before she opened her mouth, every lens in the chamber turned to her. The cameras knew exactly where to look. She adjusted the mic, not to amplify her voice, but to mark control. Her tone was cool, controlled, sharp enough to cut. Are we criminalizing help now? A few gasps, then scattered applause from her side of the aisle. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because let's be clear, she continued, what we just witnessed wasn't oversight. It was a targeted spectacle. I've spent my career fighting for communities that have been overlooked, underfunded, and written off for generations. And now, apparently, helping them as grounds for suspicion. She glanced toward JD. Didn't look away. Some of us are done waiting for permission to fix what should have been fixed decades ago. Applause grew louder. A few in the gallery even stood. Someone in the back whispered, "She's turning it." JD watched without moving. "Let me say it plainly," Jasmine said, locking eyes with the room. This is about race. This is about reallocating attention. The moment investments flow to Black and brown communities, suddenly it's called a conspiracy. She turned slightly to face the gallery, her voice warming with conviction. They say we built murals instead of bridges. Maybe, but we built them in places where people were told they didn't deserve either. So don't call that vanity, call it visibility. And if that offends you, then maybe the real issue isn't the funding. It's the fact that someone like me had the power to move it. Silence followed, but it wasn't the silence of shame or defeat. It was the silence that comes after a well-delivered monologue. The kind that feels like a closing statement, until someone dares to stand and refuse the cue to end. JD did. He didn't rise. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned toward his mic and spoke with a calm that cut through applause like a scalpel. "You helped some," he said, "by erasing others." Just 5 words. But they landed like a verdict. No flourish, no dramatics, just weight. The clapping stopped. Jasmine froze just for a second. Not visibly, but something behind her eyes shifted. A flicker of recognition, not defeat, recognition. Because she knew what he meant. This wasn't a policy dispute. This was a moral line, quietly drawn across a map full of missing towns. JD continued, barely above a whisper. "You didn't fund equity. You funded optics. You didn't fix the system. You bypassed it on camera, while the clinics and the factories and the forgotten waited for the funding that never came." Cameras zoomed in. No one interrupted. The gavel didn't fall. Because the room had changed, no longer a place for talking points. Now it was something else entirely, a courtroom without a verdict. Jasmine lowered her eyes for just a moment, then gathered her papers and sat down. No further response. No closing line. JD didn't look at her again. The screen behind them still glowed with the memo. Strategic narrative compliance supported via soft platforms. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone saw it. And though nothing had been decided officially, something had undeniably shifted. The truth hadn't won, but it had interrupted the show. By the time JD left the hearing room, the clip had already been uploaded. A young congressional intern, seated 3 rows behind the witness table, had captured the entire 5-minute exchange on a personal phone. Not out of protocol, but out of instinct. They hadn't added commentary, no music, no filters, just raw footage. JD's voice, Jasmine's rebuttal, and the final moment of silence. That silence became a sound of its own. Within 2 hours, the clip hit 300,000 views. By the end of the day, it was pushing 2 million. It spread across platforms like a spark on dry timber. Some called it a mic drop moment. Others called it a smear campaign in disguise. But one thing was certain. Everyone was watching. Headlines split like tectonic plates. Vance challenges Crockett on ghost fund. Sparks national debate. White lawmaker questions. Black representatives' urban initiatives. Rural America gets a voice, and it's not yelling. The 5 words that silenced the room. JD didn't speak to the press. He sat in his office surrounded by unopened mail and messages stacking like digital bricks. His inbox had become a battleground, half outrage, half gratitude. The subject lines told the story. "How dare you attack her? Thank you for saying what no one else would. Come visit our town. We were erased too." He opened one envelope at random. Inside was a handwritten letter on lined notebook paper. I'm not political, never wrote to anyone in D.C. before, but we had a bridge grant approved in 2021. Then nothing. You read out our town's name on national TV. That was the first time in years we felt seen. JD folded the letter, placed it in a drawer marked Keep. Then Marcus walked in holding his phone. You need to see this, he said. He turned the screen around. A tweet, now pushing 80,000 retweets, had gone viral. He didn't shout. He pointed, and the room went quiet. Below it, a screenshot of JD sitting in silence as the memo glowed behind him. The internet had turned that still frame into 1,000 interpretations. Some saw it as statesmanship. Others saw it as calculation. A few asked if it was all performative, a new kind of political theater for a digital age. JD didn't answer those questions, not publicly, but privately he reread the memo again, lingering over the line that had started it all. Strategic narrative compliance supported via soft platforms. It sounded more absurd the longer he looked at it, and more dangerous, because it hadn't been shouted. It had been whispered, designed to move quietly, to escape attention until it was already irreversible. Now it was no longer invisible, but it wasn't defeated either. The hearing had ended with no vote, no motion, no conclusion. But it had cracked something open. A few late-night pundits called JD's moment the softest act of defiance in modern politics. A few cable hosts mocked it as budget poetry for the cameras. But somewhere between the snark and the praise, something deeper took hold. People were listening, not just to JD, but to the names of the towns, the railroads that had rusted, the clinics that had closed, the people who had been told again and again to wait for help that never came. JD stood at his window late that night, looking over the Capitol dome. No lights on in the chamber, no more headlines for the evening. Just one quiet thought running through his mind. This time, silence wasn't the end of the moment. It was the beginning of it. The clip was barely 48 hours old when the backlash began. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that tightens slowly, like a necktie before a televised takedown. It started with headlines. Surgical, deliberate. JD Vance weaponizes budget hearings to undermine racial equity efforts. Vance's attack on Urban Recovery Fund sparks outrage in Minority Caucus. Was this about numbers or optics? Then came the cable segments. Panel after panel, talking heads speculating not on what JD revealed, but why he had revealed it at all. Some called it a dog whistle. Others labeled it a soft ambush masquerading as transparency. A handful applauded him, but even they sounded cautious, as though praising him too loudly might suggest alignment with the wrong kind of courage. Then the pieces started dropping anonymously. An op-ed with no byline accused JD of having once questioned the value of urban recovery programs altogether. A quote from a college paper, heavily excerpted, torn out of its decades-old context. A political blog published a leak suggesting that JD had voted against a funding bill for at-risk youth in 2019, omitting the amendment he'd proposed that redirected those funds to veteran suicide prevention. The headlines weren't lies, but they weren't the truth either. JD's team scrambled to respond, but he didn't. Not publicly, he gave no interviews, declined every request for a sit-down, refused to tweet. Instead, he sat at his desk, pen in hand, notebook open, and wrote. Not press releases, not rebuttals, reflections. When a lie is loud and the truth is quiet, they don't cancel each other out. They just collide and hope the audience picks sides. He didn't need to be told what was happening. This was textbook. A moment of honesty had stepped outside the stage lights, and the directors behind the curtain didn't like it, so they flipped the script, turned JD from whistleblower to villain, from concerned public servant to obstructionist, from question asker to divider. He understood. What stung wasn't the critique. It was the ease with which the country could be turned against its own conscience when the right language was used. Jasmine Crockett, for her part, didn't attack him directly. She didn't need to. The machine moved on its own now. A few well-placed quotes. A fundraiser email titled, "We know what this was really about." A cable appearance where she said smoothly, There are always those who feel threatened when we shift the spotlight. The message was clear. JD had crossed a line, but the question lingered. Which line? The budget line? The party line? The invisible line where courage becomes inconvenience? Marcus tried to get him to speak up, drafted statements, booked a friendly podcast slot. JD refused them all. People don't remember how loud you were, he said. They remember whether you told the truth while standing still. And so, he stood still. In his silence, he began gathering letters again. Not from donors, from towns, handwritten, folded 3 times, often just a paragraph. You got us noticed. They stopped pretending our clinic delay was a clerical error. We don't blame you. We know how this works. Each one went into the drawer marked keep, and each one reminded him that his voice didn't need defending. It needed remembering. Because sometimes survival in politics wasn't about speaking louder. It was about speaking once and letting the echo do the rest. The road into Brayton, Ohio, curved through silence. No billboards, no noise, just long stretches of frost-bitten grass and buildings that once moved with purpose. JD had driven past this town before, on campaign trails, on policy tours. But this visit wasn't scheduled, and there were no handlers this time. Just him, a borrowed car, and a stop he couldn't delay any longer. Brayton was a paper mill town, or at least it had been. For nearly a century it had fed and clothed itself on cellulose and labor. The mill had closed 6 years ago, its last shipment wrapped in plastic and memory. Now it stood like a ghost, massive, rusting, every window boarded up like a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. But word had spread. Somehow, without flyers or phones, people knew JD was coming. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the old Union Hall. No signs, no shouting. Just a quiet group of maybe 2 dozen. Jackets zipped, arms crossed, boots muddy. The kind of people who had lived through too many announcements, too many visits that ended in nothing. JD stepped out of the car and nodded. He didn't wave, he didn't smile too much. He just nodded, like one worker greeting another at the start of a long shift. An older man rolled forward in a wheelchair, his flannel shirt pressed, his hat stitched with the insignia of a Marine unit. His eyes weren't angry, just tired in a way that didn't sleep off. He didn't introduce himself. He just spoke. My brother died waiting for care. JD's chest tightened. 3 counties away, the man continued. Drove 4 hours round trip every month for his meds. Then they cut the shuttle when fuel costs went up. He missed 3 appointments. By the 4th, it didn't matter. The air felt heavier than the sky. We don't want charity, the man said. We want the truth. JD opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the others. A woman holding a baby, wrapped in a worn army jacket. A man with grease-stained knuckles and eyes that hadn't stopped scanning the mill even after it died. A teenager who looked too young to understand, but too old not to. These weren't voters. Not today. They were witnesses. And JD, after all the headlines, all the debates, all the orchestrated outrage, had no speech to give them. No clever turn of phrase, just the quiet truth scraped down to its roots. He nodded, voice low. You'll get it. Not a promise, not a slogan, just a commitment spoken without decoration. The man nodded once, then turned his chair and backed into the line of others. No applause, no pictures, just a moment. JD walked with a few of them around the mill. They passed the old payroll office, the break room windows still smudged with names. One woman pointed at the wall. They told us this would be rezoned for a food co-op, she said. Then a creative tech hub. Now they don't even lie. They just stop answering emails. JD didn't take notes. He didn't need to. Because what was broken here wasn't infrastructure. It was faith. The belief that their town even counted enough to be lied to properly. And still, they waited. Not because they expected rescue, but because you don't leave your name unspoken. Not even if the world forgets. That night, JD sat in a diner booth alone. The waitress brought black coffee and nothing else. He opened his notebook and wrote only 3 words. Brayton still waits. The envelope was tucked between constituent letters and policy memos. No return address, no congressional seal. Just JD's name written in a looping cursive that immediately stopped him in his tracks. He set down the rest of the stack and held the envelope like it might vanish if handled too fast. He already knew who it was from. The handwriting belonged to Mrs. Cora Daniels, his high school civics teacher, the one who had taught him what the Constitution said and what it didn't, who made her students argue both sides of every issue, who never raised her voice, but made the whole room sit straighter when she asked a question, who once told him during detention of all places, "You think too fast for your own good, Vance. Use it to ask better questions." He hadn't seen her since graduation day. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice, neat, centered, handwritten in blue ink. "Dear JD, I saw the clip, all of it, the silence, the names. That moment mattered more than most will admit. But not because of what you uncovered, not because of the money, not even because of who you challenged. It mattered because of how you did it. You didn't perform it, you pointed to it. There's a difference. And whether you meant to or not, you sent a message far beyond Congress. There are kids watching you, JD. Kids like you once were, sharp, unsure, angry without knowing why. And now they've seen a man point at power and say, not like this. So here's your assignment. Be worth their attention, all of it, every messy, unfinished second of it. Because they won't remember your committee seats or bill numbers. They'll remember whether you made them feel braver or smaller. And for what it's worth, no matter what they say now, I'm proud of you. Even if you never say another word, you already said enough. Mrs. Daniels." JD didn't move for a long time. He just sat there at the edge of his desk, elbows resting on his knees, the letter open in his hands like a fragile piece of something old and sacred. Not because it praised him, he didn't need that, but because it recentered him, reminded him that what started in Washington never ended there. He looked across the room to his leather-bound journal, pages filled with notes, quotes, and policy fragments. Quiet places where he sorted things out without cameras. He stood, walked to it, opened the back cover, and carefully taped the letter inside. He didn't frame it. He didn't tweet it. He didn't tell his staff. It wasn't for public record. It was for alignment. Later that night, while reviewing testimony for an upcoming veterans hearing, he paused again and read the final line a second time. Even if you never say another word, you already said enough. He thought about Brayton, about Gary, about the names on the map. He didn't feel like he'd done enough. Not yet. But he understood something now that he hadn't before. The kids watching wouldn't remember whether he won the argument. They'd remember whether he stood in the room anyway. And so he would. Even if they tried to write him out of the frame, he would stay in it, on purpose. The envelope was marked confidential, but it had no return address, no stamp, and no courier service. It was waiting on JD's desk before sunrise, slipped under the door sometime in the quiet hours. Inside was a single sheet of folded cardstock, thick, expensive, the kind used by law firms and lobbyists who didn't want fingerprints but still wanted to make an impression. On the front, see page 4. No greeting, no signature. He opened it slowly. Attached was a donor list, sourced from a back-end reporting database, not available to the public. At the top of the page was the letterhead for the Urban Rebalance Initiative. That same soft gray logo designed to look neutral, inoffensive, even friendly. But the names weren't friendly. Not to JD, they were powerful. Tech firms, national think tanks, media PACs, advocacy networks based out of Silicon Valley and Georgetown. Groups with names that sounded civic, even wholesome, but whose board members sat on the holiday card lists of lobbyists and power brokers. And next to each name was a donation amount, written not in round numbers, but with surgical precision. $1,025,500. Future Horizons, Data Group $750,000. Storybridge Media, PASK $950,000. Elevate Civic Design Coalition, $1 million. Crescent Influence Partners. Each one footnoted by a vague purpose. Community storytelling, urban identity programming, soft infrastructure engagement. It wasn't illegal, but it was surgical. JD turned to Marcus, who stood behind him reading over his shoulder. "Any of these jump out?" JD asked, already knowing the answer. Marcus pointed to a name in the margin. Crescent Influence Partners. It was quiet on paper, but beneath the shell company sat a web of connections. 2 campaign bundlers, 1 communications firm tied to Jasmine Crockett's congressional PS, and a digital analytics group currently handling media strategy for several high-profile progressives. JD sat back in his chair, expression unreadable. "No one's breaking the law here," Marcus said. "Of course not," JD replied. "They're writing new rules. It was policy by narrative, funded by story. The Urban Rebalance Initiative hadn't just redirected money, it had redirected attention, transforming dollars into press kits, speaking tours, branded buses, and glowing community panels filmed in 4K. For every red-pinned town left in JD's office map, there was a viral highlight reel somewhere else. A TED Talk, a ribbon cutting, a staged moment of urban inspiration with Crockett's name somewhere in the credits. And now, with this list in hand, JD had the final piece of the pattern. Motive. The fund wasn't built for theft, it was built for visibility. Strategic investment not in people, but in perception. The paper trail, however faint, now linked influence, imagery, and money. JD stood and walked to the window. The Capitol stood in the distance, as quiet as it ever was before dawn. But he didn't feel small beneath it. He felt positioned, not at the center, but at the hinge between what the country assumed and what it needed to finally see. "They built a machine," JD said quietly. "A soft one. Runs on narrative and applause. But it costs real towns to keep it fueled." He looked at Marcus. "We trace the money. We follow every name. We tie it to every project that vanished while they filmed progress." Marcus nodded. "And then what?" JD turned back to the donor list, the soft gray logo staring back like a blank mask. "Then," he said, "we hold up the mirror." The community center was built in the shell of what used to be a library. The walls still held faint outlines of where bookshelves once stood. Now, folding chairs formed semicircles, and the podium in front of them wobbled every time someone stepped too hard on the floor. But the room was full. Mothers, veterans, youth mentors, a few small business owners. Most wore jackets with patchwork stitching, the kind that kept out the cold better than they looked. No cameras, no journalists. Just the kind of gathering that still mattered, even if no one reported it. JD Vance stood at the back, no staff beside him, just a pen and a small notepad he hadn't yet used. He hadn't come to speak, he'd come to listen. The event was titled Accountability and Allocation, a mouthful for something that meant simply, where did the money go? When it was Ava's turn, she didn't adjust the mic. She didn't clear her throat or thank the sponsors. She just stepped up, hands trembling slightly, her voice a quiet thunder, ready to fall. "I'm Ava," she began. "Single mom, Southeast Detroit. I work 3 jobs. I lost my housing voucher 7 months ago after the pilot zone I lived in got reclassified for urban redevelopment." She paused just long enough for the words to sink in. "They said it was uplift, that we were part of the future, but nothing got built. Nothing changed. The flyers stopped coming. The neighborhood got quieter." Another pause, heavier this time. "We didn't rise, we just sank quieter." JD's pen stilled midair. Ava continued. "They brought in consultants, told us to write down our dreams on colored sticky notes, called it a community visioning wall. My son wrote a bed with no mold. I wrote, don't move us again. 2 weeks later, the agency closed our case file, told me the funding stream had shifted. Someone in the back of the room muttered, again. Ava looked out at the crowd, not accusing, not pleading, just present, raw and resolved. They said we were part of something bigger, that narrative-based engagement would attract attention. But we didn't need attention. We needed groceries, rent relief, a way to stop drowning while smiling for the brochure. Silence filled the room. Then unexpectedly, a single phone recording started to roll from a volunteer seated near the aisle. The clip wouldn't be polished. The lighting would be bad, but the words would cut through. JD looked down at his notepad. He didn't write policy terms. He wrote 2 words, quote her. By the next day, Ava's clip was online. No filter, no title card, just her voice. We didn't rise. We just sank quieter. The internet didn't shout. It echoed. Within hours, thousands of comments rolled in. Where did the money go? This is the voice that matters. Uplift for who? JD didn't retweet it. He didn't need to, because this wasn't about him. This was Ava's microphone now. And unlike most headlines, her words didn't end at the period. They kept ringing, even when the video stopped playing. The hotel room was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brought rest. It was sterile. Off-white lampshades, faint hum from the vent, the soft thunk of the mini-fridge kicking in every 15 minutes. J.D. Vance had checked in without security, without press, and without his staff. He hadn't come to escape. He had come to pause. The past 2 weeks had moved fast. Too fast. From the hearing room to Ava's video, from donor lists to red pins stretching across forgotten towns, the story had taken on a life of its own. Headlines were still circling. Interviews were still being requested. His name was in rotation again on evening news crawlers. But JD wasn't interested in how loud things had become. Tonight, he wanted to sit in the silence and face it. He stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, tie on the nightstand, water running low and steady. The mirror in front of him wasn't kind, not because it was unflattering, but because it reflected exactly what it saw. His eyes were tired. Lines had set deeper across his forehead. He didn't look like someone who had just landed a blow in Congress. He looked like someone carrying names. Toledo, Gary, Wheeling. Avenue. He dried his hands slowly, then looked back up into the mirror, not just at his face, but at the man behind it. And then quietly he said it. I used to want applause. Now I just want accountability. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't for anyone else. Just a truth he hadn't admitted aloud until now. He walked back to the desk in the corner of the room and opened his laptop. The screen's glow cast a soft light on the wall as he clicked open a blank document. Title, Budget Accountability and Federal Reallocation Transparency Act. BAFRTA, a terrible acronym. But that didn't matter. What mattered was what it could do. Not punishment, not retaliation, but framework, something that couldn't be bent into slogans or hidden inside soft language grants. The bill would require every federal reallocation of funds, no matter how small, to be recorded, disclosed, and mapped. No more ghost grants, no more red pins without names, and no more urban uplift programs without direct local accountability. He began to type. Section 1, Mandatory Public Reporting of All Budget Reallocations, over $250,000. Section 2, Congressional Review of Nonprofit Federal Partnerships, Section the 3rd. Required impact statements for all discretionary transfers. Each line was simple, concrete, traceable. He wasn't writing to impress a headline. He was writing to stop the forgetting. Every sentence was a quiet answer to Ava's voice, to Mrs. Daniels' letter, to the veteran in Brayton who'd said, "We don't want charity. We want the truth." JD leaned back after a few hours, eyes burning from the screen, but the document now had shape. It wasn't final, but it was real. He stood again and walked to the window. The city below flickered. Movement, life, distractions. 1,000 lights that looked brighter than they were. But JD wasn't fooled by that anymore. He didn't want spotlight. He wanted clarity, and clarity rarely came with clapping. He turned off the lights, the laptop still humming quietly behind him. Before lying down, he opened his journal one last time and wrote beneath Mrs. Daniels' letter, "Reform isn't loud. It just lasts longer." The title was simple, almost too simple. The Budget Integrity and Regional Equity Act. No flourish, no branding committee, no acronym that could be slapped on coffee mugs or printed on buttons. Just a name that said what it was and did what it said. J.D. Vance submitted the draft quietly, without a press conference. There were no balloons, no coordinated rollout. The file went straight to committee review with a cover letter that began, "This legislation ensures that federal dollars, once authorized, remain accountable to the people and regions for whom they were intended. In a democracy, even invisible money should leave a visible trail." The core of the bill was threefold. Mandatory public disclosure of all federal reallocations, over $250,000 within 30 days of transfer. Transparency of all nonprofit recipients of federal discretionary funds, including affiliations with elected officials, campaigns, or committee staff. Congressional notification of any reclassification of designated recovery zones. JD knew the language was bureaucratic, but that was intentional. He didn't want fire, he wanted function. And almost immediately, the fire found him anyway. The first calls came from friendly offices, quiet suggestions to refine the wording, to carve out exceptions. One aide used the phrase, operational flexibility. Another said, let's not kill useful tools in the name of noble principles. Then came the less subtle calls. You're going to choke out federal innovation. We all do back-end shifting. You're acting like you just invented morality. You realize this touches half the subcommittees, right? Jasmine's people won't say it, but they're already lining up your opposition. JD listened, nodded, took the meetings, but his position didn't move because it wasn't personal. It was structural. He wasn't writing a bill to punish Jasmine Crockett. He was writing it to prevent her system from becoming the new template for power. A system where money flowed faster than memory and attention outran accountability. Inside the Capitol, the pushback grew sharper. Some called the bill redundant, others disruptive. A few accused JD of performative populism, a phrase that, ironically, required its own focus group to land. But behind the doors that really mattered, the ones without cameras, JD heard the truth. If this passes, we lose discretion. We lose narrative control. We lose leverage. That's when he knew the bill had touched something real. He walked out of a meeting one evening, leather folder in hand, into a corridor lined with portraits of former senators. He paused under one, a face half forgotten, a name half remembered, and thought, how many of them tried to fix the game instead of playing it? He opened his journal and wrote, reform doesn't survive by being clever. It survives by being stubborn. That night, his team printed physical copies of the bill and walked them floor to floor. Not for show, but because paper doesn't vanish in inboxes. JD placed one on the desk of every holdout who hadn't returned a call. He didn't ask for support. He just left a sticky note on top that read, what are we afraid people will find out? By the week's end, the whispers had turned to interest. A few undecideds asked for a second briefing. A senator from Montana said, I've got 3 towns that lost funding, just like the ones you mapped. A Republican from Nebraska crossed the aisle without blinking. The bill hadn't passed, but it had entered the bloodstream. Not loud, but deep. The folding chairs weren't filled. That was the first thing JD noticed. There were maybe 18 people, scattered like punctuation across a room that had space for 80. The lights flickered overhead, one buzzing louder than the rest. The American flag in the corner drooped on its pole. A hand-painted sign on the back wall read, Town Hall, open mic, open minds. There were no reporters, no banners, no applause lines, which was exactly why JD showed up. The event was in Lincoln Hollow, Ohio, a town not large enough to land on most maps, but large enough to have lost its only full-time ER last winter. When JD's staff had suggested a virtual session instead, he'd said no. If they're still standing in these towns, so should I. He stood now at the front of the room, no microphone, no podium, just a chair turned backward, a legal pad in his hand, and sleeves rolled to the elbow. I'm not here to talk, JD said. I'm here to listen. A man in the second row raised a calloused hand. We've had a pothole on Main Street for 7 months. Took out 2 tires and my son's axle. County says the reallocation stalled their patch budget. A woman beside him added, our school's gym roof leaks every time it rains. They said the repair was approved. Then suddenly it wasn't. Another voice from the back. They closed the VA satellite clinic, said it was being absorbed into a larger regional system. Closest one's now an hour and 15 minutes away. JD didn't interrupt. He wrote each point down. Not bullet points. Names, places, dates. He wasn't collecting data. He was collecting stories. Someone asked what his bill would actually do. JD answered plainly. It makes it harder to hide things. That's all. No more moving money without saying where it's going and who benefits. It won't solve everything, but at least it shines a light. The woman with the leaky gym scoffed. They always say light, then nothing changes. JD nodded. That's fair. She blinked, not used to being agreed with so easily. A few more spoke. One about bus routes that vanished, one about farmers losing broadband subsidies, one about a war memorial cleanup project that was promised, then ghosted. Through it all, JD listened. Not with the kind of nodding that waits to speak, but with real stillness. The kind of stillness that lets others breathe deeper. When the last person finished, there was no applause, no backslaps, just a brief silence and a few people gathering their coats. JD stood. I'll be back, he said, not to campaign, to report. You deserve to know if your names disappear from the budget again. Someone asked, what if they don't put them back? JD paused. Then at least they won't vanish quietly. He folded his legal pad, tucked it under his arm, and walked out without ceremony. As the wind picked up outside, JD didn't feel like a leader. He felt like a clerk, someone charged with recording things too long ignored. In his notebook later that night, he wrote, no applause, just truth, no stage, just names. And for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel behind schedule. He felt exactly where he was supposed to be. The vote was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. By 11 a.m., JD had already rewritten his closing statement 3 times. Not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because the words still didn't feel clean. He didn't want applause. He didn't want revenge. He wanted to get it right. At 12:17 p.m., he was walking down the west corridor of the Capitol, headed toward the cloakroom, when he saw her, Jasmine Crockett. She didn't stop, just slowed slightly, her heels clicking in rhythmic defiance. As they passed, she tilted her head. Not enough for cameras, just enough for meaning. If I vote yes, she whispered, it's not for you. JD didn't respond, not with words, not with a nod. He just kept walking, because that wasn't a threat. It wasn't even shade. It was something far more rare in politics, an opening. The chamber filled by 310. C-SPAN was live. Staffers huddled in the back rows whispering odds. Aides refreshed House floor tracking apps. The speaker called the vote. JD didn't watch the screen. He watched the people. One by one, hands went up or buttons clicked. Green, red. A few present. Some made eye contact, some didn't. One Democrat from Michigan who'd been on the fence gave JD the faintest nod. Half permission, half apology. A Republican from Kansas flipped unexpectedly. No warning, no explanation. When Jasmine's name came up, she abstained. The screen blinked for a moment. Then the final count locked. 218 minus 216. The room didn't erupt. There was no standing ovation. Just a pause. Then low murmurs. Then the kind of bureaucratic rustling that follows every close vote. Papers stacked, phones checked, exits eyed. JD stayed seated. His aide leaned down. You won. JD shook his head gently. No, we moved. There was a difference, one that mattered. Outside, the press waited. Microphones out, anchors poised, questions prepared. JD walked past them. No statement, no spin. Just a quiet descent down the marble steps, into a breeze that carried the faint scent of cherry blossoms and car exhaust. He didn't go back to his office. He didn't call his team. He walked 3 blocks to an old stone bench near the Capitol reflecting pool. Saturday watched a toddler throw breadcrumbs to ducks. Listened to the water ripple with no urgency at all. He pulled out his notebook, the same one that now had Jasmine's quote taped inside, and a town hall list tucked in the back. He wrote, "Reform isn't a moment, it's erosion. Quiet, patient erosion of a wall built on silence." And under it, today, a crack appeared. Just then his phone buzzed, a message from his civics teacher. That was quiet. It was also everything. He smiled, closed the notebook, and exhaled. Somewhere, a headline would call it a narrow win. Somewhere else, a columnist would call it political maneuvering. There would be op-eds, think pieces, and manufactured outrage. Maybe even a meme or two. But sitting on that bench, there was only one thing JD knew for certain. The system had noticed. And for the first time in years, it blinked. The rain had just cleared over Wheeling, West Virginia, leaving the sidewalks slick and shining beneath a soft winter sun. The newly restored Veterans Center didn't have a ribbon-cutting ceremony or a parade. No cameras, no press vans, just a modest opening, quietly announced in a folded community newspaper near the back page. But J.D. Vance showed up anyway. He didn't tell anyone. No aides, no security detail. He arrived in an old jacket, collar turned up against the wind, hands buried deep in his pockets. The front door creaked slightly as he pushed it open and stepped into the clean, echoing lobby of the Veterans Center that had been closed for nearly 5 years. It smelled like new paint and fresh hope. Near the entrance, a small bronze plaque sat screwed into the wall just beside the doorframe. No big font, no flourish, just a plain line etched with quiet weight. Restored by the Budget Integrity Act. J.D. stared at it for a moment, blinking once before nodding slowly. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't take a picture. He simply stepped inside and walked the halls. He passed a room where a nurse was helping an older man into a wheelchair, both laughing gently over something neither of them would remember in 5 minutes. Down another corridor, volunteers were arranging books on a shelf. A young receptionist looked up, ready to greet him, but paused, recognizing the face, then let him pass with just a small smile. He didn't speak a word. In the rehab wing, he lingered at a window looking out at the river. A man wheeled himself up beside him, Vietnam-era vet, judging by the patches on his vest. They exchanged glances. J.D. gave a respectful nod. The vet returned it. Nothing needed to be said. As J.D. turned to leave, his hand briefly touched the doorframe again, right where the plaque was bolted. Then he stepped out into the wheeling air. Colder now, quieter somehow. Not every win comes with applause. Some arrive on whispering feet, carried by policy and patience. 2 weeks later, in a small-town high school in Iowa, a civics teacher dimmed the classroom lights. 30 seniors sat scattered across the desks, restless after lunch, notebooks half open. On the projector, a video began playing, C-SPAN footage of the congressional hearing. The moment where J.D. Vance stood and revealed the budget discrepancies. The camera didn't shake, the voice didn't rise. But the room, even in that footage, seemed to grow still. One student in the back shifted in his seat, then raised a hand. "Why did she get away with it for so long?" he asked quietly. The teacher paused the video. It was the kind of question they didn't usually ask. Too pointed, too sharp. But today it landed with weight. The teacher looked at the class and said, "Because too few were watching, now they are." There was a long silence. Then another student added, "But what happens next? Like, what actually changes?" The teacher walked over to the whiteboard and wrote one word in capital letters. Attention. "Democracy doesn't break in big explosions," she said. "It slips away while we scroll past it. One unasked question at a time. One budget shift nobody notices. But the moment someone starts listening, really listening, that's when things start to shift back." The students stayed quiet after that. They watched the rest of the hearing footage with new focus. Not because it was flashy or dramatic, but because it was real. Because it reminded them that power doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like noticing. Back in his Washington office, J.D. Vance stood in front of his bookshelf, holding a piece of paper he once found by accident. A binder left behind, a whisper that started it all. The memo had no name, no signature, just those vague, calculated lines of policy language that changed millions of lives without fanfare. He placed the page in a simple frame. No ornate wood, no gold, just black trim, glass, and beneath it, a handwritten note on plain cardstock. "A whisper is enough, if someone finally listens." J.D. stood staring at it for a long while. The framed memo rested atop a filing cabinet near his desk, just beneath the shelf where he kept letters from constituents, some angry, some grateful, most emotional. His journal was open on the desk behind him, a new entry half finished. He didn't write anything more. Instead, he closed the journal, slid it into the drawer, and pressed the frame gently into place, like a final period at the end of a long, unsparing sentence. No celebration, no grand finale. Outside his office window, the Capitol dome glowed faintly in the overcast afternoon. Another vote waited, another hearing scheduled. JD buttoned his jacket, reached for a folder of notes, and walked out. He didn't say goodbye to the memo. He didn't need to. Because some legacies don't ask to be remembered. They echo, quietly, persistently, like a whisper that stayed. This story reminds us that real change often arrives without fanfare. JD didn't shout or seek the spotlight. He listened, noticed, and acted. In a world of noise and performance, his quiet persistence became a force louder than applause. Legacy isn't about fame. It's about what continues to matter after we leave the room. The frame memo, the plaque in Wheeling, the student's question. These are echoes of impact. This is a story not of heroes, but of choices made when no one is watching. Question for you. Have you ever witnessed a quiet act of integrity that made more impact than a loud declaration? What stayed with you? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.